You get up, you look at the dresser your grandmother gave you, you select that thought in your mind. And if there's a reward that goes along with it, something that's going to feel good, the amazing effect is that your brain begins to produce the exact chemicals in anticipation of that event. So your body is beginning to anticipate or expect that future, and your body's preparing itself for that event. Now, there's nothing wrong with that because you're anticipating the reward. But the antithesis begins to become a problem. When you're thinking about going to work and sitting next to the coworker you judge and hate, when you're thinking about waking up in the morning and you got to look for your pain in your back, and there it is because you look for it. You have a deadline for something that's taking all of your time and energy. People have certain problems in their life that have emotional correlations. So then as they begin to look at those issues and things in their life based on the knowns, they begin to create the very emotions that keep them enslaved to the past experiences, and reality stays exactly the same. So if feelings and emotions are the end product of past experiences, and you can remember experiences better because you can remember how they feel, and those emotions are familiar, it tells us two things. Number one, nothing new is happening in your life. And number two, if you can't think greater than how you feel, or feelings have become the means of thinking, then you are literally thinking in the past. And your life is going to reflect that. So then getting people to begin to change that from the old self to the new self really requires a tremendous amount of awareness. And that's where my work comes into play.
That also brings up a good point too. When we're talking about projecting into the future, our emotional awareness, sometimes our uncertainty, our anxiety has us projecting a reality that may not be real in our own minds. We might have an anxiety that's not based in reality. Can we talk a little bit about that and how emotions play a part in that, especially when it comes to uncertainty?
Okay. Great question. Because according to the psychological and scientific model, the majority of people in their waking day, in a normal day, spend about 70% of their time living in stress. And living in stress is living in survival. And the actual definition of stress is when your body's knocked out of homeostasis. Stress is when your body's knocked out of balance. The stress response is what your body innately does to return itself back to order. You have three types of stress. You have physical stress, like trauma, injuries, accidents, falls. You have chemical stress, like bacteria, viruses, blood sugar levels, heavy metals in food, hangovers, whatever. And you have emotional stress, like traffic jams, internet connections, second mortgages, single parenting, 401ks, family tragedies. All of those things knock the brain and body out of balance. Now, all organisms in nature can adapt to short-term stress. A pack of coyotes chases a deer in the forest. The deer outruns the coyotes. The stress is over. The deer returns back to homeostasis and it grazes again. The event is over. When the deer perceives a threat in its external environment, it turns on a primitive nervous system called the fight or flight nervous system. And that autonomic nervous system, that sympathetic nervous system, begins to mobilize enormous amounts of energy for some threat in the external environment. Now, deer has all its physiology changed, all the blood is sent to the extremities, heart rate increases, respiratory rate increases, pupils dilate. The 1,300 chemicals that are created in a matter of seconds is to cause the deer to survive in some difficult condition. Now, human beings have the same mechanisms, and when we perceive a threat in our external environment, like a lion, we are going to run or fight or freeze. But if you've had problems with your coworker, or you've had a very difficult experience with your mother-in-law, the moment you perceive your mother-in-law or your coworker, you have a past experience with them, you're going to turn on the same primitive nervous system just like you're being chased by a lion. So what was once highly adaptive now becomes very maladaptive, because So 70% of the time, people are selecting the worst case event in their life and emotionally embracing it, and they're programming their autonomic nervous system into a very specific destiny. And it turns out if you keep doing that and you create the emotions of fear and worry and anxiety, and you do that for 10 years or 5 years or 3 years, your body is going to unconsciously become programmed to fear. And it's going to have a panic attack without you. Try as you may with your conscious mind to control it. You've programmed it subconsciously. And now the body as the mind is running the show. So the hormones of stress create the emotions of anger, of aggression, of hostility, of violence, of frustration, of hatred, of fear, of anxiety, of guilt, of shame, of hopelessness, of powerlessness, depression. Those are all chemicals that are derived from the hormones of stress. And when we live by the hormones of stress, we become very selfish. Why? Because when you're in survival, you got to take care of the self. Your attention is on your body, right? Your attention is on your external environment. There's predators out there. The rush of adrenaline causes the senses to become heightened, and you're a materialist, and you're trying to predict the future because there's better chances of survival if you can predict the future based on the past. When that occurs then, over time, the body begins to break down because it's a scientific fact that the hormones of stress downregulate genes to create disease in the long term. So if you can turn on the stress response just by thought alone, and the hormones of stress can make you sick, then your thoughts can literally make you sick. So the question is, if your thoughts can make you sick, is it possible then that your thoughts can make you well? People are looking for something outside of them to change their internal state. It's kind of a Newtonian principle. You wait for your wealth to come to feel abundant. You wait for your healing to occur to feel wholeness. You wait for your success to show up so you feel empowered. You wait for your new relationship to show up to feel love. You're waiting for the event outside of you to happen to change how you feel inside of you. That's cause and effect. And we're conditioned based on consumerism and marketing and programming that that's the way it works. To get something to relieve yourself. And the problem with that is that people begin to confuse true happiness with pleasure. And they're not the same thing. So people who have addictions like that typically have had some very difficult past experiences that have branded them emotionally. And they just don't know how to change. They just don't know. And they're just looking for some relief inside of them so that they can make that feeling go away. So we can become distracted by our external environment for a period of time, But then when you realize that the sports car or the new wardrobe or the vacation or the whatever people do to try to make the feeling go away, the novelty of that thing outside of us wears off because we're trying to re-identify with our environment. When that goes away, the next thing that people do is they look for some immediate change. And so they take a drug. They drink something, they gamble, they watch pornography, and the event outside of them changes their internal chemistry. And the moment they notice that the pain or the emptiness goes away, the moment they feel differently, they look to see what caused it. And this is when the attachment begins. Here's the problem though. The rush of chemical change that takes place, the pleasure centers in the brain, there's a huge release of the pleasure chemicals. And the release, the intensity of those release of those chemicals begins to desensitize the receptor sites in the brain. So as the brain chemicals are released and the receptor sites become desensitized, the next time you gamble, the next time you take the drug, the next time you shop, you need a little bit more the next time. So then what happens is the pleasure centers start to get recalibrated to a higher and higher level. So you're always going to need more to make that feeling go away. Sounds like an addiction to me. And so people get lost because then without the dependency on that external substance, the body, which has become the mind, is craving its relief. And so an addiction really is when the body is the mind. So you may say with your conscious mind, I want to give up drinking, I want to give up pornography, I want to give up gaming, I want to give up over shopping, I want to give it up consciously. But the body has been conditioned from the past subconsciously. And so now the body's the mind. Now, no one's told people that true change can happen within them. And so then when people start to realize that there's a gap between the external world and how they present themselves to the world and their attention on the outer world and their attention on their inner world and how they really feel. And if they're spending the majority of their time looking outside of them for change and they don't want to look at this feeling, all they want to do is make that feeling go away, they're going to wind up in trouble. So true change is when you start looking within and you become conscious of your unconscious thoughts. In neuroscience, it's called metacognition. You become aware of your habits and your unconscious behaviors. And you look at those emotions that are connected to past experiences and allow yourself to observe them. So then think about this. If 95% of who we are by the time we're 35 years old are those programmed states, the moment you're observing how you think, how you act, and how you feel, it means you're no longer the program. You're now a consciousness observing the program, and you're beginning to objectify your subjective self. You are seeing yourself through the eyes of someone else. Turns out that the size of the frontal lobe, the crowning achievement of the human being, 40% of our entire brain, that's what separates us from all other species. It's the boss, it's the CEO, it's the conscience, it's the creative center. It's what speculates possibilities, it's what learns from its mistakes, it's what has intention, attention. It regulates and controls behaviors and emotional reactions. When your forebrain begins to turn on, when that begins to happen, you are now beginning to become the executive in your life. You're starting to gain more control over your life. If you're living primarily as the body-mind, then the hindbrain is looking for some chemical relief. So by the mere fact that you can begin to observe who you're being means you could modify who you are to do a better job in life. So then, going from the old self to the new self, I call that crossing the river of change. Because the hardest part about change is not making the same choices you did the day before. And the moment you're not going to think the same way, make the same choice that leads to the same behavior, that creates the same experience, that produces the same emotion, you are not going to feel like yourself. It's going to feel uncomfortable. It's going to feel unfamiliar. There's going to be a certain amount of uncertainty. You are going to feel the state of unpredictability. And that's the moment you step into the river of change. And the moment you step into the river of change, then that discomfort means you're in the unknown. And so the body, which has been conditioned to the mind, who's been living in the past, would rather hold on to the guilt, because at least it's familiar. They'd rather hold on to their own emptiness and unworthiness than not feel that, because that's the unknown. So people cling to the familiar, and it transcends rationality. So then, the moment you step into that river and the body has become the mind, the body starts sending signals back to the brain because it wants to return back to the familiar self. And this is when we start to hear all the chatter, the sub-vocalizations. You're not good enough. You're too much like your mother. It's your ex-husband's fault. Start tomorrow. This doesn't feel good. What's wrong with me? I want to kill myself. That's the body saying, I don't want to go in the unknown. I don't trust the unknown. I'd rather hold on to this. Now, going from that old self to the new self is the biological, the neurological, the chemical, the hormonal, the genetic death of the old self. And most people, they step out into that unknown and it feels so uncomfortable, they can't predict it, they return back to the known. People say to me, well, I can't predict my future. And I always say to them, well, the best way to predict your future is to create it. Not from the known, but from the unknown. And that void, that unknown, is the perfect place to create from. Now, why is this dangerous? Because when you're living in survival 70% of the time, There's better chances in survival from running from the unknown than embracing the unknown, right? If there's a predator out there, or you hear something around the corner and you can't see it, that's an unknown. You're going to run. You're not going to go, and it's not a time to trust. It's not a time to open your heart. It's not a time to communicate. Here, kitty, kitty. It's not a time to do that. It's time to run. You'll never trust the unknown in that state. So if people are living by these emotional states of survival, they're never going to want to step out into the unknown because they can't predict the future. So they'd rather hold on to what they have. Turns out that those emotions of stress are highly addictive, really are. And that's bothered me ever since I wrote the book, because people watch things in their external environment and they accept, believe, and surrender to that information without any analysis, and they're programmed. And so when you and I start waking up and say no to those programs, and we start to think that we're maybe a little bit more unlimited than we're given credit for, and it's not driven for profits or self-interest, but when people start to wake up and say, hey, you know, I healed myself of this condition, I healed myself of Parkinson's, I healed myself of lupus, I've healed myself of cancer, I've healed myself of rheumatoid arthritis, I've healed myself of chronic pain, I healed myself of food allergies. Hey, yeah, I was abused as a child, yeah, that's right, I was beat up by a violent father, and I lived in vulnerability and fear for the last 25 years, but that fear has signaled the wrong gene, and I developed this genetic condition. The doctors said I had no way of healing. But when I overcame that fear and I broke out of it, I started to signal new genes in new ways, and that disease doesn't exist. Let me tell you, if you listen to that woman's story, and you listen to all the trials that she had gone through, and how she overcame herself, and she reached a place of such wholeness and self-satisfaction that she could care less if she had the disease, and that's the moment it went away, and you listen to that story, it's going to give you permission on some level that it's possible for you to do the same. You see someone dance the salsa well, you'll dance the salsa better. You see someone hit a golf ball like Rory, you'll hit a golf ball better. You see someone lead with love and compassion in their life, you will lead with love and compassion in your life. You see someone stand on a stage in front of 500 people and talk about how they overcame their cancer after their husband committed suicide, and the 3 years that it took her to do it, you will be inspired that it's possible for you. So then it has to start with a new consciousness, and that it's going to come from common people doing the uncommon, and that's where my passion